we talk about the stages of Alzheimer's disease, the 7 stages, we often talk and hear about what the person has lost. But today I want to do something just a little bit different because even though Alzheimer's disease is changing the brain and there are abilities that do change, there are still abilities that remain. And so the goal isn't just to ask, what can they not do anymore? We also want to figure out what can they still do. And so that's where I want to focus today is what can we still do? Let's start with stage 1. So stage 1 is where there's no functional impairment. So essentially normal functioning. At this point, there's not really any noticeable memory problems. The person's living independently. They're managing their own responsibilities. They're making decisions, handling their finances, having normal conversations, and doing their normal day in and day out routine. However, there may be changes in the brain that are happening, but you can't necessarily see them. They're not visible quite yet. So for example, someone in this stage may forget where they put their keys occasionally. Like right now, I couldn't tell you where my keys are at this point, but I could retrace my steps and I could find them. And then I'm going to continue my day as if nothing actually happened. And so there are potentially some memory problems. There are some minor forgetfulness. And just because you forget and misplace your keys does not mean you're in stage 1 of Alzheimer's disease or that you have Alzheimer's. But you can still work. You can still manage your finances, cook, socialize, drive, and make decisions and live independently. So there may be absolutely nothing visible or obvious to people around them whenever they're in stage 1. Stage 2, this is where there is very mild cognitive decline, is where the changes just begin to start showing up. Okay, this might look something like forgetting people's names, misplacing things, having trouble finding words, or forgetting where you place something. Again, me. So stage 2, there's something very important though here to remember. Everybody's going to forget things, right? We all forget things, but stage 2 does not automatically mean that someone has Alzheimer's disease. These changes actually can be very normal with aging. It can be very normal with stress, me, or medications, or any other conditions that may be going on. And so it does not automatically mean that you have Alzheimer's disease. But an example of this may be a person may put their sunglasses somewhere. They may put them down. Actually, on the way driving here, I was like, where did I put my sunglasses? You might search, and eventually you're going to be able to find them and know exactly where they were. And when you find them, you're like, oh yes, now I remember putting them there. What can they still do? Okay, they can still have conversations. They can still make decisions. They're able to complete familiar tasks or care for themselves, or even participate in their daily normal activities and routines. The key is their independence is largely intact here. All right, now for stage 3, which is where people are going to begin to notice that something is a little bit off or different. The person may actually be having more difficulty remembering information that they've just recently learned. So they may repeat questions. They may struggle with planning or organizing or completing complicated tasks, not simple tasks, but more complicated tasks. You may hear them say things like, did I already tell you that? Or can you remind me what time that appointment is? So for example, someone might have an appointment at 2 o'clock. They write it down, but then they ask their daughter 3 or 4 times, what time was my appointment again? I cannot remember what time my appointment was. They may still know what the appointment is for and be perfectly capable of getting dressed and going, with some support, but they just can't remember recently learned items. So what can they still do? They can still participate in conversations, very much socially appropriate. They can make many everyday choices. They can eat on their own. They can dress themselves. They can go on walks, enjoy hobbies, and even interacting with other people. They may need reminders or a little bit more structure, but they're still very much themselves. All right, we are halfway through our 7 stages of dementia. The next is stage 4. Stage 4 is when Alzheimer's actually begins interfering more significantly with somebody's everyday life. So this is where you might see problems with their finances. They may have difficulty with medication management or even planning meals or executing those meals or remembering recent events that have happened. They may become very overwhelmed easily with complicated tasks. They also begin having difficulty remembering personal details or even current events. So for example, a person who used to manage their household and their bills may suddenly have unpaid bills sitting on the counter. They may say things like, oh my gosh, I thought I paid that. They may no longer be able to safely manage their entire financial process independently and may need some support in that, but that doesn't mean that they can't participate. So with stage 4, they can still participate in these activities. They might just not be able to do it completely on their own. They can still manage part of the activity. So let's say that we're doing medication management. Instead of filling their pill box for them, have them sit down with you and you go over each bottle and say, okay, we need one of these in the morning every single day. So they're still participating in the activity. They're not just managing it themselves and independently. For example, for meals, okay, maybe they can't put it on the stovetop because it's not safe any longer, but they could still help you cut things up or, pull things out of the fridge and stir things. Like they're still able to participate. They just can't manage the entire task on their own. They're needing a little bit of support for safety reasons and just to remember and initiate the activity. With stage 4, it is incredibly important to make sure that you're helping them to maintain as much independence for as long as possible. All right, let's talk about stage 5. This is where a person with Alzheimer's in stage 5 is going to need more assistance with their daily activities. So they're going to be forgetting things like their address or their phone number, or just information about their own personal life. They may need help choosing appropriate clothing for the weather or remembering to even take their medication. But here's something that caregivers do a lot at this stage is instead of just allowing them to participate in the things they're able to do, they just assume that they cannot do anything. And so they'll say, oh, just let me do it. So it's very important, just like in stage 4, to allow them to do the pieces of an activity that they're still able to participate in. So for example, they may not be able to do all of the laundry. It may take them a long time to do it, or they may not be able to figure out how to operate the washer, but once the laundry comes out, they can help you fold. And even if they're only able to fold one washcloth, that's still participation in the activity, so let them participate. They still should be able to feed themselves. They're still potentially able to walk independently unless something else, is going on physically with them. They're able to participate in their grooming and dressing. They may just need setup or help finding the items that they need to complete the task. They will love music and respond really well to music and familiar foods. A lot of sensory activities would be great. They may have difficulty finding their words or understanding words, and so slowing down your speech, using a lot of pointing or take me and show me, many times that can help. During this stage and just slowing everything down a little bit. So having a lot of nonverbal communication where you're smiling at them or holding their hand or just sitting next to them, that's going to provide a level of comfort. You can also use a whiteboard like I am to help communicate because many times they may not be able to verbally say it, but they could read it and understand it. So you can still use, a whiteboard or a piece of paper to write down things for them to read versus using verbal language to communicate with them. All right, stage 6. Stage 6 is where significant assistance is usually needed. So memory is going to continue to decline. The person may have difficulty recognizing familiar people. They're potentially going to experience personality changes or behavior changes. They may start wandering. They're going to need increased assistance with bathing and dressing and toileting and other daily activities. Their communication is going to become more difficult at this point. They're not going to be able to find words or potentially even verbally communicate at all. This stage can be incredibly hard for families because this is where they look at them and think that's just not my mom anymore. They don't recognize me any longer, and I don't really recognize them anymore. So let's talk about what the person still is able to do and how you could get them to participate. Let's start with like cooking, for example. They can't follow the entire recipe, but you could hand them a bowl and a spoon and have them stirring an ingredient. Maybe they can't name a song for you, but if you played something that was familiar to them, they will potentially sing. And if not sing, they will still probably dance around to music that's familiar to them. Touch is a really big thing at this stage because, holding someone's hand or putting your hand on their leg or, giving them a nice hug, that's going to help to communicate to them that they're safe. They can also participate in activities and they're going to communicate with body language and expressions. That might be where we start seeing a little bit of behaviors because behavior is communication. And so when something's not going right or doesn't feel right, they might act out with behaviors because they're not able to use their language any longer to communicate and express what they're feeling inside. And remember, at this stage, they are going to be able to recognize feelings and safety and love. And so making sure that we're surrounding them with that is incredibly important at stage 6. All right, and our last stage is stage 7. So stage 7 is actually the most advanced stage of Alzheimer's disease. And at this point, the person's typically going to require extensive assistance with daily activities. Communication is going to be very limited. They're going to have difficulty walking, potentially swallowing, or even just sitting upright or controlling their movements. And eventually, they're going to lose the ability to independently perform many of their physical activities, even things like going to the bathroom on their own or feeding themselves. And this stage is where it becomes really difficult not to focus on what they've lost because they're going to need so much assistance. But I want to remind you that they are still in there. They can still hear, they can still feel, they can still listen to music and enjoy warmth and comfort and love. It's okay for us to love on them. It is okay for us to hug them. It's okay for you as a husband to go and hold your wife's hand. It's okay for you to sing to them and play them music. They can still hear you. They can still feel you. And so make sure that just because they've lost so much, that we don't forget that they still have so much more to give us. When you think about the 7 stages of Alzheimer's, don't just make a list of the things that they're not able to do any longer. I want you to start asking yourself, what can they still do? What can they still participate in? What makes them smile? What sounds and smells and textures still bring them comfort? Because the goal of caregiving is not to do everything that someone needs as quickly as possible. It's actually to provide that right amount of support so that they can continue doing whatever they are still able to do, even if that ability changes from stage to stage. Make sure you follow along for more because you don't have to do this alone.